Patton didn't punish the enemy, he punished his own. He fired officers in the middle of war, not quietly, not politely, fast, public, final. Most commanders fear the enemy's artillery. Patton feared something else. He feared hesitation. Because in Patton's world, war isn't a chess match, it's a race. And the only thing worse than losing ground is losing time. That's the part people forget when they talk about him like a legend. They remember the speeches, the swagger, the pearl-handled pistols, the lightning advances. They don't remember what happens when lightning stalls, when the machine slows down, when the road clogs, when the fuel doesn't arrive, when the map lies, when the men are exhausted, when the enemy refuses to collapse on schedule. And when that happens, Patton doesn't just see a problem, he sees a threat to the entire campaign. Not because one unit is late, but because one delay can infect the whole front. A single hesitation can spread like smoke. One cautious order becomes a habit becomes a culture, and culture becomes defeat. That was his fear. Not failure in general, failure by inches. Because war doesn't always break you with one big disaster. Sometimes it kills you with 100 small delays. So Patton built his command around one obsession: momentum. Momentum was not a preference, it was a religion. Move fast, hit hard, keep moving. Never let the enemy breathe. Never let your own men settle into comfort. He demanded speed the way other leaders demanded obedience. He didn't ask for aggressive action, he assumed it. And when his army moved like he wanted, it looked unstoppable. A spear thrust through chaos. A force that didn't just defeat enemy positions, but outpaced enemy decision-making. That's how he wanted to win. Not by being smarter on paper, but by being faster in real life. He believed the enemy could survive a punch, but the enemy couldn't survive confusion. So he aimed to create a tempo so brutal that the other side never fully understood what was happening until it was already too late. That mindset creates results. It also creates pressure. Because if speed is the standard, then reality becomes the enemy. Reality is fatigue. Reality is mud. Reality is broken bridges. Reality is radios that fail at the worst moment. Reality is columns of vehicles stretched for miles, stuck behind one wreck, one crater, one wrong turn. Reality is a fuel truck that doesn't show. Reality is a unit that fought for 2 days and can't squeeze one more mile out of its legs. Reality is an officer looking at his men and thinking, if I push them again, I lose them. To most commanders, that's a reasonable calculation, a human calculation, a responsible one. To Patton, it could look like poison. Because Patton wasn't measuring the day in comfort or exhaustion, he was measuring it in opportunity. An opportunity doesn't wait for you to feel. Opportunity is a door that opens for a moment and then slams shut. It doesn't care how heroic you are. It doesn't care how tired your men are. It doesn't care how good your reasons sound. If you don't move when the door is open, you don't get a second chance. That belief made him dangerous, and it made him volatile. Because once you convince yourself that time is the true enemy, you begin to treat delay like sabotage. Not always consciously, but emotionally. And emotions inside a chain of command are not harmless. Patton lived under a kind of pressure most people never experience. He wasn't just fighting the Germans, he was fighting the clock. He was fighting expectations. He was fighting superiors who demanded results yesterday. He was fighting logistics that could not keep up with ambition. He was fighting a battlefield that didn't care who he was. And he was fighting something inside himself, a need to prove that his style of war was not just bold, but correct. Because if his system worked, he was a genius. If it failed, he wasn't just wrong, he was reckless. That's the hidden engine behind the myth, the constant pressure to justify the pace. When an army advances fast, everyone praises the commander. When an army slows down, everyone asks questions. And questions are dangerous for a man like Patton, not because he couldn't answer them, but because he couldn't tolerate the idea that the answer might be simple. Sometimes the answer is, you can't go faster. Sometimes the answer is the men are at the limit. Sometimes the answer is you need to pause, reorganize, resupply, recover. That answer isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like victory. And to Patton, it didn't just feel disappointing, it felt fatal. Because slowing down in his mind wasn't neutral, it was sliding backward. And sliding backward is how armies die. So when the tempo slowed, he didn't simply adjust plans, he searched for the cause. And here's where the chain turns dark. Because the cause, in his mind, was often not the enemy. It was someone in his own system who lacked nerve. Patton believed hesitation spreads. He believed fear spreads. He believed caution spreads. So he treated uncertainty like infection. Cut it out fast. If a commander hesitated, that hesitation didn't stay with him. It moved outward. It moved to the officers under him, who then acted carefully. It moved to the staff, who then started planning cautiously. It moved to the troops, who then started expecting delays, expecting retreats, expecting the whole machine to slow. And once an army expects to slow down, it slows down. This is why Patton could be brilliant and terrifying in the same breath. He could take a situation that looked complicated and reduce it to one thing: keep moving. That simplicity is powerful. It is also merciless, because it doesn't leave much room for nuance. It doesn't leave much room for "I tried." In Patton's world, you either kept the momentum or you were part of the problem. That's why the punishments weren't just discipline. They were symbolic. They were messages. They told the entire force, this is what happens when you break tempo. And the men heard that message, not as motivation, as warning. Because once you've seen an officer removed like a piece of broken equipment, you understand something instantly. Your rank won't save you. Your excuses won't save you. Your good intentions won't save you. Only results will. And there's a reason that shocks an army. Armies run on confidence in the chain of command. They run on predictability. Not predictability in the enemy, predictability in leadership. Men will walk into hell if they trust the structure above them. But when a commander starts firing people sharply, publicly, and with anger in the air, everyone begins to wonder the same thing. Is this discipline or instability? Because there is a line between high standards and loss of control. There is a line between decisive leadership and personal eruption. And a leader who cannot manage his own pressure can destroy trust faster than the enemy ever could. That's the core tension in this story. Patton's demands created momentum. They also created fear. Momentum is addictive. Fear is corrosive. And the most dangerous moment comes when a man who lives on momentum feels it slipping away. Because then he doesn't just push harder, he looks for someone to blame. Inside his own system. Not because he's petty, because he's trapped. He's trapped by the belief that any delay is fatal. He's trapped by the identity of being the commander who never slows. He's trapped by the expectation that speed is always possible. So when speed becomes impossible, something has to give. Sometimes the plan gives. Sometimes the logistics give. Sometimes the men give. And sometimes Patton gives. But he doesn't collapse in private. He collapses outward, into decisions, into firings, into moments that make an army flinch. Because the truth is, Patton's harshest actions weren't just about discipline. They were about fear. Fear that the moment would pass and never return. Fear that the front would harden. Fear that the enemy would regroup. Fear that history would move on without him. And when that fear reached a boiling point, he did something that seemed unthinkable to the men around him. He punished his own officers like they were the enemy. Not for paperwork, not for procedure, not for minor errors, but for slowing the war down. And once you understand that, the firings stop looking like random cruelty. They start looking like something else, a chain reaction. Pressure builds, patience snaps, careers end. And the consequences ripple outward, not just through strategy, but through morale and trust. Because after the first time you see it happen, the army learns a new lesson. The enemy can kill you, but your commander can erase you. And that changes how people fight. It changes what they report. It changes what they risk. It changes what they admit. It changes the truth. And a war without truth inside the chain of command is a war that eventually collapses under its own illusion. Patton understood war better than most, but he was still human. And human pressure doesn't vanish because you wear stars on your helmet. It builds, it accumulates, and if a man doesn't release it, he redirects it. And Patton redirected it. He redirected it into the chain of command. And that is where the story turns from legend into something colder. Something that shocked his army. Something that left officers staring at each other afterward, quietly asking what no one wanted to say out loud. Not, will we win, but who's next? The first firing didn't start with a shouting match. It started with a map, a line on paper that was supposed to move, a line that didn't. Staff officers watched the same symbols, the same arrows, the same timestamps. Everything looked normal, until it didn't. Because when you build a whole campaign around speed, any pause becomes a crisis. A unit reports it's delayed, a bridge is out, a road is jammed, a battalion is scattered, the enemy is stronger than expected. Any one of those reasons sounds sensible on its own. But Patton didn't hear reasons, he heard friction. And friction is what kills momentum. That's what his people didn't always understand. To them, delay was a problem to solve. To Patton, delay was a disease. He believed hesitation spreads. So when the advance slowed, he didn't just ask, what happened? He asked something sharper, who let this happen? Because in his mind, the enemy wasn't the only force that could stop an army. A cautious officer could do it too. That's why the first firings felt so personal. Not personal like revenge, personal like betrayal. An officer didn't just fail a task. He failed the tempo, and tempo to Patton was the war. He would drive to the front and look at the same situation other commanders would study for hours. A blocked road, a tired unit, a confused report, a missing fuel column. Then he would reduce it to one brutal conclusion: move. If you can't move, someone else will. It wasn't a conversation, it was a test. And the terrifying part was how quickly the test ended. An officer would explain. Patton would listen for a moment, not for details, for attitude, for aggression, for certainty, for hunger. If he heard caution, he heard weakness, and weakness in his mind was contagious, so he cut it out. That's what the firings were, a surgical act, fast and bloody. Not because Patton enjoyed humiliating people, but because speed was his language. He didn't correct, he replaced. And when a commander fires you, the message is obvious. You are not part of the solution. You are the obstruction. Imagine what that does to everyone watching. One moment you're listening to a briefing. The next moment you realize the man next to you has been erased. No dramatic ceremony, no long investigation, just a decision. Then a new name fills the gap. This is where people make a mistake about Patton. They assume the firings were about paperwork, about minor discipline, about high standards. But high standards don't require public fear. What Patton created wasn't just standards, it was atmosphere. A climate where officers learned the wrong lesson. Not be better, be safer. Because after you see a career end in an instant, you stop taking risks that might look like failure. You stop sending bad news up the chain. You stop admitting confusion. You stop saying, I need time. You start saying what keeps you alive. And that's the first crack. Patton wanted initiative, but fear kills initiative. Patton wanted honesty, but anger trains people to edit the truth. That's the paradox at the center of his command. He could inspire men to do the impossible, and he could terrify them into silence, sometimes in the same day. The ripple effect hits fast. Staff officers begin to write reports that look cleaner than reality. Commanders begin to overpromise because underpromising looks like cowardice. Subordinates begin to push when they should pause because pausing looks like disloyalty. Momentum returns. But it returns for the wrong reason, not because the system is healthy, Because the system is scared. And scared systems move. They also break. But it's not obvious at first. In the short term, the firings can seem like proof. Patton's methods produce motion. A new commander arrives with fire. The unit starts moving again. The map line shifts. From the outside, it looks like genius. A leader identifies weakness, removes it, fixes the problem. From the inside, it feels different. Because the army isn't asking, how do we beat the enemy? The army is asking, how do we survive the commander? And once that question exists, it spreads. The shock wasn't just that Patton fired someone. Armies fire officers. Relief of command happens. The shock was how it felt, how fast it was, how emotional it was, how little room there was for explanation. It felt like instability wearing a uniform. Because discipline is supposed to feel controlled. This didn't. This felt like pressure finding a target. And when pressure finds a target, it doesn't choose based on fairness. It chooses based on proximity. The nearest obstacle. That's how a commander becomes dangerous to his own people. Not because he is evil, because he is overloaded. Because every delay becomes a personal threat. Because if the advance slows down, he doesn't just lose ground, he loses identity. He loses the story he's trying to prove. He loses the belief that his way of war is unstoppable. And that fear makes a man do something extreme. Not once, again and again. Each firing becomes easier. Because the first one breaks a taboo. After the taboo breaks, it becomes a tool. And tools get used. Soon, officers begin to anticipate Patton's reaction before they even make decisions. They begin to command with his voice in their head. Push harder. Don't hesitate. Don't admit limits. It creates a kind of shadow command. Patton isn't just issuing orders, he's living inside everyone's choices. And that's powerful. Until it isn't. Because there's another thing armies run on besides speed. Trust. Trust that your leader is fair. Trust that mistakes will be measured. Trust that you can speak honestly without being destroyed. When that trust erodes, the chain of command becomes performance. Not communication, performance. Officers stop thinking, what's true? They start thinking, what will sound strong? They don't send the full picture. They send the picture that keeps them in place. And that's when the enemy gains a hidden advantage. Not because the enemy is stronger, because your own system is lying to itself. This is why the army was shocked. They could handle a hard commander. They could handle strict standards. They could even handle anger. What they couldn't handle was unpredictability. Because unpredictability makes everyone defensive. And defensive armies don't take initiative. They wait. They hedge. They protect themselves. So the firings created a contradiction. Patton wanted boldness. The atmosphere he created punished boldness when it didn't work perfectly. He wanted speed. The fear he created made officers reluctant to take the kind of risks that create real speed. Not the speed of movement, the speed of decision. And when decision slows, everything slows. Even if vehicles keep rolling. There's an ugly truth here. Ruthless decisions can create short-term results. A firing can jolt a system awake. It can shock a unit into motion. But shock isn't a strategy. It's a drug. It wears off. And once it wears off, you need a stronger dose to get the same effect. That's how a command climate becomes addicted to crisis. And Patton, whether he meant to or not, was building that addiction. Pressure builds. He strikes. The system jumps. Then pressure returns. And the next strike has to be sharper. This is the slope. This is how high standards slide into something else, something colder, something that doesn't just correct the army. It reshapes the army's nervous system. And when an army's nervous system is fear, it can still fight, but it fights differently. It fights like it's being watched. Because it is. Patton was always watching, and he was always measuring one thing: momentum. So when momentum slipped again, when reality pushed back harder, he didn't calm down. He didn't lower the standard. He tightened it. And that's when the firing stopped looking like leadership decisions and started looking like a man at war with time itself. By the time the next crisis hit, the atmosphere had already changed. Officers weren't just leading men, they were reading Patton's mood. They weren't just planning routes, they were planning for his reaction. And that's when you know a command climate is no longer healthy. Because when fear becomes the background noise, the first casualty is truth. Not truth in speeches, truth in reports. The kind of truth that tells you a unit is running out of fuel, that a road is impassable, that the men can't keep marching, that the enemy isn't breaking the way you expected. Those are not excuses, those are facts. But facts become dangerous when a commander treats them like weakness. So the bad news begins to arrive late, filtered, softened. And Patton, who demanded honesty, ends up receiving a different product, not reality, a performance of confidence. That makes the pressure worse, because now he's commanding in a fog he doesn't know exists. And when a commander believes momentum is possible, but momentum isn't happening, he doesn't blame physics, he blames people. That's how the next confrontation forms, not from one mistake, from accumulation, a late report, a missed objective, a traffic jam, a fuel shortage, a unit that pauses to reorganize. Each delay is small. Together, they feel like betrayal. And Patton is not a man who handles betrayal calmly. He drives forward. He goes to the point of friction. He wants to see the obstacle with his own eyes, because he trusts what he can witness, and what he witnesses isn't always the full story. He sees a stalled column. He sees officers standing around. He sees men resting. He doesn't see the missing fuel truck. He doesn't see the broken radio. He doesn't see the bridge that collapsed 2 miles back. He sees stillness, and stillness, to Patton, is the enemy. So he speaks in the language he always speaks when he feels time slipping. Short, cutting, absolute, move, now. No excuses. An officer tries to explain, and in that moment, there's a fork. If Patton hears aggression inside the explanation, if he hears a man who is angry at the delay and hungry to fix it, Patton might tolerate the friction. But if he hears caution, if he hears a man who sounds resigned, Patton feels something snap. Because resignation is what defeats armies, not bullets. Resignation is what makes men stop believing. So Patton attacks resignation like it's an enemy position. He doesn't argue with it, he destroys it. The officer isn't just defending a decision, he is defending his identity. Competent, responsible, measured. But those are not the traits Patton is rewarding in this moment. Patton is rewarding one thing: relentlessness. So the exchange becomes less about facts and more about tone. Not what happened, but who are you? Are you the kind of commander who forces movement out of chaos? Or are you the kind of commander who explains why movement is hard? Patton doesn't want an explanation, he wants a weapon. And if you don't sound like a weapon, he doesn't keep you. This is where the meltdown begins, not as screaming, as certainty. A dangerous certainty, the kind that makes a decision feel clean, even when it's driven by emotion. Because anger loves clean solutions. Replace the officer, solve the delay, restore the tempo. It feels logical, but it's also a release. It gives pressure a target. It turns anxiety into action, and action feels like control. So Patton takes control. He doesn't warn. He doesn't negotiate. He doesn't consider. He relieves the officer, on the spot, in front of people, and it lands like a gunshot, because everyone understands what just happened. The commander didn't just correct a mistake, he erased a man. He removed him like a faulty part in a machine. And when a man is removed like that, the machine learns a lesson. Never be the part that slows down. Never be the person holding the bad news. Never be the voice that says, "We need time." So the fear tightens. But here's the twist. Fear doesn't just make people move. Fear makes people hide. If a unit is struggling, the struggle becomes something to conceal. If an officer is unsure, the uncertainty becomes something to mask. If the enemy is stronger than expected, that strength becomes something to downplay. Because honesty now has a price. And once honesty has a price, the war becomes harder to command. Not because the enemy improved, because your own system started lying for survival. Patton wanted to win by speed, but speed requires clarity. You can only outpace the enemy if you know where your own limits are. If your own people are afraid to admit limits, you lose the very thing you need most: real information. So the firings, meant to protect momentum, begin to threaten it. That's why this wasn't just harsh discipline, it was a meltdown under pressure. A man trying to keep the tempo alive by cutting into his own chain of command. A man so obsessed with forward motion that he starts treating his own officers like obstacles. And once that line is crossed, the command climate changes permanently, even if the map starts moving again. Because a map doesn't show you morale, it doesn't show you trust, it doesn't show you what officers whisper to each other after the commander leaves. It doesn't show you the moment someone decides not to report a problem yet. Just one more hour, just one more day. Maybe it fixes itself. And problems that aren't reported early don't disappear, they grow. So while Patton's decisions could shock the machine into motion, they also planted something inside the machine that would eventually demand payment. From the outside, it looked like it worked. The line moved, the reports improved, the pace returned. And in war, results have a dangerous power. Results silence doubts. Results turn brutality into necessary. Results make people stop asking whether the method is healthy, because the method delivered. That's the trap. Short-term momentum can make anything look justified. A new commander takes over and immediately pushes harder. He reorganizes, he threatens, he inspires, he forces movement out of chaos. Convoys start rolling again. Units hit objectives they were missing. The tempo sharpens, and Patton sees what he wants to see. Proof. Proof that the hesitation was the problem. Proof that replacing the officer fixed it. Proof that the standard was correct. It reinforces everything. It tells him, when pressure hits, you strike. When the machine stalls, you remove the part. When doubt appears, you crush it. And because the map responds, the system rewards the behavior. That's why fear can become policy. Fear produces motion, for a while. But here's what most people miss. The movement isn't always health. Sometimes it's panic. Sometimes it's the kind of motion a man makes when he's trying not to drown. The unit moves because it's terrified of being next. The staff works because they don't want to be seen as slow. The commanders drive men because they don't want to be the one Patton looks at and asks why. So the machine accelerates. But it accelerates with stress in the gears, and stress doesn't stay hidden forever. Because fear-based command has a signature. It doesn't kill you in one dramatic collapse. It changes your decision-making. Quietly. Officers start overcorrecting. They push when the smarter move is to pause. They attack when the smarter move is to flank. They take ground when the smarter move is to consolidate. Not because they believe it's best, because it's safer to be seen moving than to be seen thinking. That's the strange thing about Patton's command climate. It punished hesitation so hard that it could punish intelligence. Because intelligence sometimes says, wait. And wait was a word Patton hated. So everyone learns to avoid it. They plan less, they rest less, they admit less. The machine looks aggressive, but the inside becomes brittle, and brittle systems don't show cracks until pressure returns. War always returns with pressure. Another enemy line, another surprise, another weather shift, another supply failure. It never stays easy. So the real question isn't whether Patton's firings created motion. They did. The question is what kind of motion they created. The kind that comes from confidence or the kind that comes from fear? Because confidence gives you initiative. Fear gives you compliance. Compliance is useful when the plan is simple. It's deadly when the plan needs adaptation. And war always needs adaptation. That's why the staff begins to change its behavior in ways Patton can't see. They start writing to protect themselves, not intentionally at first, just subtly. A delay becomes a temporary adjustment. A failure becomes reorganization under enemy pressure. A shortage becomes expected resupply within hours. It all sounds fine. It sounds strong. It sounds like the machine is still unstoppable. And Patton reads strength and feels relief. Because relief is rare for him. He lives in tension. He lives in urgency. He lives in the belief that if he relaxes, the war will punish him. So when the reports look clean, he wants to believe them. He wants to see the front as a moving spear again. And that desire is understandable. It is also dangerous, because it teaches the system what to feed him, not the raw truth. The version of the truth that keeps the commander calm. That's the bad news problem. When leaders explode at bad news, they train everyone to delay it. And delayed bad news becomes catastrophe. But it doesn't happen overnight. It happens through a series of small choices. A subordinate decides not to mention how tired the men are, because it sounds weak. A staff officer decides not to emphasize the fuel issue, because it sounds like an excuse. A commander decides to push one more day without rest, because stopping looks like failure. Each choice makes sense in the moment. Each choice is also a brick in a wall that blocks reality from reaching the top. So yes, the advance can speed up, but the system is starting to lose its ability to see itself. And the system that can't see itself can't correct itself. It can only continue until it hits something it can't smash through. That's when the cost shows. But even before the cost becomes visible, something else happens. The mood changes. Officers become quieter around Patton. Briefings become more careful. Meetings become less honest. Not because they're weak men, because they're adapting to survive. They're learning that the commander doesn't just demand success, he demands the appearance of certainty. So uncertainty becomes dangerous. And when uncertainty becomes dangerous, curiosity dies. People stop asking questions that might reveal problems. They stop exploring alternatives that might slow the pace. They stop pushing back when the plan doesn't match reality. They nod, they comply, they move. And Patton gets what he wants, for a while. But here's the brutal truth about fear as fuel. Fear burns hot. Fear burns fast. It gets you motion today. Then it demands payment tomorrow. Because men can't live in fear forever and stay sharp. They either break or they harden. And when they harden, they stop trusting. They stop caring about the mission as a shared purpose and start caring about the mission as a threat. A threat to their reputation, a threat to their career, a threat to their survival. That is not the same kind of army. It may still fight, it may still move, but it's not the same. Patton believed he could outpace the enemy by will, and his will was immense. But will doesn't replace logistics. It doesn't replace sleep. It doesn't replace fuel. It doesn't replace the physical limits of men and machines. So every time reality pushed back, the pressure returned. And each time it returned, Patton needed the system to respond instantly. No hesitation, no debate, no weakness. That demand became a cycle. Pressure rises, Patton strikes, movement returns, pressure rises again. And cycles like that don't end gently, they escalate. Because once you've used shock to restore tempo, shock becomes your reflex. And reflexes under stress aren't always wise, they're automatic. So the question isn't just what Patton did to his officers, it's what that act did to the entire Army's nervous system. Because now, even success carries tension. Even victory feels like walking on glass. And in an army, walking on glass doesn't just cut the feet, it cuts the trust. And without trust, command becomes fragile. Not because men are cowards, because they're human. And humans, under constant threat, stop giving you their best thinking. They give you what keeps them safe. That's the difference between an army that can win a battle and an army that can survive a long war. Patton could win battles. The question is whether his methods were building an army that could endure the cost of his own pressure. Because pressure doesn't disappear, it only moves. And in his command, it was moving down the chain. Until it hit someone who couldn't absorb it. And when it hit that point, the next eruption was not going to feel like discipline. It was going to feel like something breaking. When an army is afraid of its commander, it doesn't stop fighting, it stops telling the truth. That's the cost that doesn't show up on the map, Because the map only shows motion. It doesn't show what men stop saying. It doesn't show what they stop admitting. It doesn't show what they start hiding. And once hiding becomes normal, command becomes guesswork. Patton wanted speed. But speed without truth is just running blind. The bad news problem grows quietly. At first, it's small. A staff officer delays a report because he wants a clearer picture before he brings it to Patton. A commander downplays a shortage because he believes he can fix it by morning. A subordinate skips a detail because he doesn't want to sound weak. None of it feels like lying. It feels like management. It feels like protecting the mission from unnecessary panic. But it's also protection from Patton. Because everyone has seen what happens when Patton receives a message that sounds like hesitation. The reaction is not calm. It's heat. And heat makes people cautious in the wrong direction. So the chain of command begins to develop habits that keep it stable in the short term and unstable in the long term. They smooth the edges. They sanitize the language. They remove uncertainty. And uncertainty is the most important thing to deliver upward. Because uncertainty is where danger lives. But if you can't speak uncertainty, you can't solve it early. So issues evolve in the dark. A fuel problem becomes a movement problem. A movement problem becomes a timing problem. A timing problem becomes an operational failure. And when the failure finally becomes visible, it looks sudden. It isn't. It's just the first time the truth makes it all the way up. That's how fear reshapes an organization. Not by making everyone weaker, by making everyone quieter. By making people act as if everything is under control, even when it isn't. And that creates a new kind of pressure. Pressure that doesn't just sit on Patton's shoulders. Pressure that sits on every officer who has to decide whether to speak honestly or survive. Every briefing becomes a test. Not a test of strategy, a test of tone. How do you report a delay without sounding like an excuse? How do you describe exhaustion without sounding like weakness? How do you ask for time without sounding like cowardice? Those are impossible questions, so officers start solving them in the simplest way. They stop asking. They stop requesting. They stop admitting. They push forward and hope the problem fixes itself. Hope becomes policy, and hope is not logistics. Hope doesn't refill fuel tanks. Hope doesn't repair bridges. Hope doesn't rest exhausted men. Hope just delays the moment reality forces itself into the conversation. So the command climate produces a specific kind of behavior. Officers become risk-averse in a way that looks aggressive. They take risks that are visible: movement, attack, advance, because those are rewarded. They avoid risks that are invisible: speaking up, slowing down, questioning, because those are punished. So you get an army that can look bold while making worse decisions. Because the best decision isn't always the fastest. Sometimes the best decision is the one that prevents tomorrow's collapse. But that decision requires the courage to tell the commander, "We can't." And in Patton's climate, "we can't" sounds like betrayal. So instead of one honest "we can't," you get 100 quiet compromises. Men move without resupply. Units advance without full coordination. Officers take routes they haven't reconnoitered properly. Staff compress timelines until the plan looks clean on paper. The machine keeps rolling. But every mile is bought on credit, and credit in war always comes due. This is why the firings were so destructive in ways people didn't immediately recognize. They didn't just remove individuals. They changed the entire meaning of leadership under Patton. Leadership stopped being about making the best call for the situation. Leadership became about avoiding being seen as the obstacle, avoiding being the one who slowed the spear. And that distorts everything. A commander who fears being fired will push his men past healthy limits. A staff officer who fears humiliation will hide uncertainty until it becomes disaster. A subordinate who fears appearing weak will stop communicating early. The enemy doesn't have to exploit that directly. Time will, because time amplifies small weaknesses. And Patton's tempo, while effective, gave time fewer chances to be corrected. Everything moved so fast that mistakes didn't get a second pass. They just became larger problems at higher speed. So the results Patton got in the short term carried a shadow, not visible in the headlines, visible in the culture. Morale is not a single number. It's 1,000 tiny beliefs. Beliefs like, my commander sees me as a person. My commander will hear bad news and respond intelligently. My commander will judge fairly. My commander won't destroy careers to release his own stress. Under Patton, those beliefs could erode, not because he was always wrong, because his anger made people feel unsafe. And when people feel unsafe, they don't stop working. They stop trusting. Trust is what lets an officer take initiative without fear. Trust is what lets a staff officer speak bluntly. Trust is what lets a commander admit he needs help. Without trust, everyone becomes a performer, and the performance becomes the mission. That's when the system becomes brittle. Because brittle systems depend on everything going according to expectation. But war never follows expectation. War is built on surprise. So the more brittle the system, the more dramatic the break when surprise arrives. That's the danger Patton was creating, and he wasn't blind. He could sense resistance. He could sense when people were becoming hesitant around him, but he interpreted it the same way he interpreted everything else, as weakness. So he pushed harder. He demanded more certainty, more aggression, more speed. He wanted to crush fear with force. But force doesn't remove fear. Force just relocates it, from the commander's mind to everyone else's. And when fear relocates, it doesn't disappear, it multiplies. Because now every officer is carrying two battles, the battle against the enemy and the battle against being next. That second battle steals focus, it steals creativity, it steals honesty, and it replaces them with one simple instinct: protect yourself. That's the moment the command climate crosses a line, not into cruelty, into dysfunction. Because an army that protects itself from its own leader cannot fully function as one organism. It becomes a collection of individuals trying to survive the same environment. They still salute, they still march, they still fight. But inside, the glue is weakening. And once the glue weakens, every shock hits harder. So when the next wave of pressure came, when reality pushed back again, Patton wasn't just dealing with delays. He was dealing with a system already strained by fear, a system already editing itself, a system already hiding, which meant his next eruption wouldn't just be about momentum, it would be about control. Because when leaders feel control slipping, they reach for the harshest tools. Not because those tools are best, because those tools are immediate. And immediate is what Patton trusted. That's what made him effective, and that's what made him dangerous. Because there is a moment when speed stops being strategy and becomes desperation. And desperation doesn't just change what you do, it changes who you become. Patton was built for momentum. That's not an insult, that's a fact. He thrived in motion the way other commanders thrived in planning rooms. He could smell weakness in a stalled column. He could feel opportunity in a gap. He could turn chaos into movement through sheer force of will. And in war, that can be decisive. Because there are moments when hesitation is truly fatal. Moments when the enemy is wobbling. Moments when the front is thin. Moments when speed can end the fight before it becomes long, grinding, and expensive. Patton understood those moments. He lived for them. The problem is what happens when the moment passes. When the enemy doesn't break. When the terrain refuses. When logistics pull the leash tight. When exhaustion is no longer a complaint, but a limit. Most commanders can shift gears. Patton struggled to accept the idea that the war might require patience, because patience to him looked too much like surrender. And that's why his harshest actions make sense psychologically. He believed he was fighting time. So when the war demanded time, it felt like a contradiction. It felt like the battlefield was asking him to become someone else. And he didn't want to become someone else. He wanted the world to submit to his tempo. That's what made him a legend. And that's what made the cracks inevitable. Because a man who defines victory as forward motion will feel threatened by any pause, even when the pause is rational, even when the pause is necessary. So he converts the pause into a moral issue. Not, we are low on fuel, but someone is not pushing hard enough. Not, the unit is exhausted, but someone is lacking aggression. Not, the situation is complex, but someone is hesitating. That conversion is the moment leadership becomes dangerous, because once the problem is moral, the solution becomes punishment, not adjustment. Punishment feels clean. Punishment creates a villain. Punishment creates a target. Punishment creates the illusion of control. And Patton, under pressure, reached for control like a drowning man reaches for air. That's why the firings were so shocking. They weren't just administrative decisions. They were acts of control. They were Patton trying to force the war back into the shape he wanted. Force the army back into the tempo he believed in. Force reality to obey. And for a time, the force worked. It pushed the machine forward. It intimidated hesitation. It accelerated movement. It rewarded aggression. But intimidation is not loyalty, it's compliance. And compliance has a limit. Because human beings can obey under fear, they can't thrive under fear. They can't adapt under fear. They can't tell the truth under fear. So even when Patton's actions produced results, the results came with hidden damage. Not always visible in casualty counts. Visible in morale. Visible in trust. Visible in the quiet ways officers change their behavior to survive. The verdict is uncomfortable. Patton's method could work. In the short term, shock can jolt an organization into motion. If the only thing you measure is speed, the method looks brilliant. If you measure the health of the system, it looks different. Because he was not just pushing the army toward the enemy, he was pushing it toward a kind of internal stress that accumulates. And accumulated stress doesn't vanish because the map line moved. It stays inside people. It shows up later. In hesitation that doesn't make sense. In reports that arrive too clean. In officers who stop taking initiative unless they are certain it will be rewarded. It shows up in a culture where the commander's mood becomes a battlefield condition. And that culture has a cost. Because morale is not softness. Morale is endurance. Morale is the ability to take pressure and still think clearly. Morale is the confidence that your own chain of command is solid. When morale drops, an army can still fight, but it fights with less flexibility, less creativity, less honesty. And those things are not luxuries, they're weapons. So the final truth about Patton's firings is this. They revealed the side of him even his supporters feared. Not the bold general on the podium, the man under pressure. The man who, when momentum slowed, didn't just demand more, he panicked at the idea of slowing down. Not in words, in actions. Actions that turned his own officers into targets. Actions that made his own army flinch. He could intimidate his enemy and his own people at the same time. That's power, and that's the cost.